Hello everyone, today we talk about the Polish heavy infantry of the 11th-12th centuries. This is a topic that goes well in parallel with one of my earliest videos on 13th century Polish heavy infantry. We observed essentially the development that partly, in fact, is reflected in today's topic of the Polish infantry towards some heavier forms, but also a different social segmentation. We will talk soon more about, say, 10th to 12th century Polish warfare, so things will be even clearer. This video is for the historical military units series, so we primarily analyze arms and armor, but we must give some sort of broader political, military, and social background to this type of unit, because why is it important and how do we categorize it just for such prototypes list of medieval military units. Of course, there is a degree of a conventional approximation. However, historically we can point out very specific concrete dynamics. So at this point we shall start from really the general, like Polish warfare. We discussed it also in a broader overview from the regional historical warfare series. Was dominated by cavalry, at least in a non-decisive sense, which is normal for Western Europe, at least until the at least fully decisive sense, meaning that cavalry was especially actually in Slavic countries numerically very important, but it could still be defeated by infantry. This was true also for the heavier Frankish world, say post-Carolingian one. It's not until the mid-12th century, basically, cavalry, and just for essentially a century and a half, is fully decisive to the degree that infantry is not able to defeat it alone. Poland is quite fascinating because it enters this phase of feudalization and Christianization, statalization, etc. In a time in which its armies were composed by a significantly large amount of cavalry. It's been estimated that in a Polish army, 1/3 of its components were mounted. As we just said, however, these horsemen were at large not as heavy as the type of cavalry, in fact, developed in post-Carolingian Europe, which was in fact less proportionally to the rest of the troops, but was much tougher and in fact capable of essentially beating also this Western Slavic one, to the degree that Poland converted, like to avoid issues with the Holy Roman Empire, and also began to found itself essentially along the lines of that model. This is very important. It's a chapter we have documented for, say, high medieval Europe in general. The same had happened to Hungary, that had even, as you know, a more step bias. Poland did have some of it, even though it was more of a sort of more sedentary based, of course, Slavic world. We've seen how far east actually Frankish military culture arrived in terms, for example, of arms and armor imports to places like the Kievan Rus, that, contrary to the iconographically stereotyped Byzantine artistic influence, actually imported an enormous amount of Western panoply, and that only later became affected by a more Eastern styles after the Mongol invasions. As a matter of fact, Ruthenia was much more similar to, in fact, a Central European country, and had, in fact, a lot in common with Poland in particular. Made a video specifically about this, observing how the Piast and the Rurikid principality system worked in a very similar way. By the way, the Poles, as you know, intervened in Ruthenian politics and warfare, but also a great similarity with Germany. This is mirrored also by some terminological influence historically. We will not go that east today, even though, of course, the Poles did, as we just recalled, there isn't much of a fixed border that you can so stably identify, especially as far as general military culture is entailed. These borders were very similar to one another. And since cavalry was the upper arm, right, the more important one, I will not digress on the before. So, of course, the migration era bias that remained more in Central Europe than important extent. We still see Draconis in 13th century German battles, etc. Right? So the Slavs actually did have a lot of that. They had remained actually backwards compared to the West. And now, however, had been consolidating towards this more feudal direction, such heavier cavalry themselves. And so the princely Druzyna retinues were really the backbone of the Polish armies. However, and this is what we talk about today, these men could rely unavoidably on the levy of every free eligible man for military service. I was hesitant because, of course, like in theory, every man has the duty / privilege to serve in arms, but aside from the fact that these armies do not mobilize more than a certain amount of troops just because of the intrinsic limits of the political and societal structures of the time, in Poland, like in other Slavic countries, you can already see how, in fact, the potential for this infantry growth, even in terms of political and military autonomies, is limited. As we will see now, actually, these are the centuries in which the greater expansion of this infantry potential and, in fact, action occur. However, as you know, in the later Middle Ages, we made lots of videos, not just about Poland, but comparatively across Central Europe. These estates will not make it to representation. They will at least make it to a degree that will heavily subjugate them to the nobility, that the monarchy will not be able to control, and that in fact will essentially make these countries explode into some sort of elective systems in which the monarchy did not have much power. And even though Poland, as you know, was a great power in medieval and in modern times, at the end of the day, it wouldn't develop like as all the Central European monarchies, that sort of more Western state that fundamentally would take over in a broader political, cultural sense in the history of civilization. Of course, we have to imagine the times and the places. I mean, 11th, 12th century Poland is an incredibly and radically brutal and primitive place compared to, say, even Germany, that wasn't this, particularly refined environment, right? And so we get, in a sense, as we'll see now, also a few evidence from this very local arms and armor. Remember that this is basically still during the Viking era. There is actually a sharp divide between the Slavic hinterland, for example, and the Norse activities. Today, there are lots of people who, for reasons that I will not digress on, tend to sort of blur the thing because, of course, they do not know anything about history to begin with, but also have very specific emotional needs to emulate certain models that, by rejecting others because they feel complex and other reasons, unfortunately, socialism leaves a very bad trace. But this is the point. You don't have to look at these similarities to actually appreciate this system that is quite interesting and fascinating on its own, right? Which in the Slavic case is especially relevant because this militia that was called to arms by the local lords and or would also at this point move autonomously. Remember, it's a very primitive early time, right? The 11th century Poland is still a world transitioning from tribalism into feudalism. And the problem of these systems that are somehow unstable, the PS monarchy manages to, from the center of today's Poland to, in fact, there's a single Like the Poles were just one of the people of today's Polish territory that managed actually to expand over all the others. It was an incredible success, but as it often happens when the extension was stretched and the resources fell short for further expansion and stable control of other lands, this system, yes, had consolidated to an important degree of structural cohesion, of, as you know, princely seniorate, recognition around Krakow, and so on. However, it would politically fragment once again on the basis of these Piast duchies that, yes, more or less again recognize one another in this lineage sense, just like in the Kievan Rus, right? That's why also they were so similar. But that wouldn't quite be able, in fact, to reunite the system until pretty late in time and under the pressure of the Teutonic. Now we're talking about centuries later, and it's some problems of this mechanism still went on, arguably, till the time Poland was actually cancelled by the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians from the map of Europe, in part because of this. Nevertheless, which means that even though the Piasts had indeed accomplished an incredibly big deal by fostering such proto-feudal retinues of pretty semi-professional, de facto professional heavy cavalrymen, there would be plenty of people out there that lived normally in these farming communities that had never had quite of tight princely control on them, that lived in some conditions of autonomy. Importantly enough, yes, very dramatic, nightmarish conditions of autonomy. The actual point here is that if you do not live under a ducal or princely authority, actually you belong to some more underdeveloped fringe areas of the system. That, however, and this degrades towards places that are not even Slavic technically, but that the Poles have to cope with unsuccessfully, by the way, such as the Prussian areas. And we saw, in fact, from the videos on Prussian infantry, something that was, very common to say in Polish, how undescribably bloody this lifestyle actually was. Of course, like the average villager, the levy was just somebody accustomed to cattle raiding, throat cutting, like not much of course, of a professional military lifestyle, but their number especially could be profitably used, especially in a world in which, again, heavy cavalry has yet to be fully molded in that professional, structured fashion, like in the West, with a pretty considerable amount of force, which is also what, especially the Polish kings, as having the princely seigneury of the land, make leverage on in order to partially contain the nobiliar influence that could in fact challenge the monarchic rise. It's a very common dynamic. This you have to understand being declined in a country like Poland. That wouldn't, again, succeed. We just said it. The Polish kingdom would turn into an irreparably oligarchic system. But that, at this point, allowed for definitely the expansion of a basis that did stabilize the system, that partially conferred to the country a satisfactory political and social balance, which again was not just about these peasants, but that had an important factor in them, right, playing in it. Of course, the modalities of participation to the army changed. The entire point of the Drużyna, and so the milites, was, of course, that specialization that would in part correspond to a disarmament of the rest of the population. So this is actually the deal. Poland will become in the 13th century a fully feudal country, alongside the western most. There was, however, still an important amount, like in all countries, of infantrymen that were expected to participate to the army, at least in theory, especially in the earlier days, paying for their own equipment, which would entail, from their side, of course, also a rota system, some sort of specialization within the same communities. So it's not a class, struggle. Essentially, villages, towns have their own elite within itself. Then they're ruled by a nobleman that will be that more feudal, professional, military figure, lording over the community, but also having their own, sometimes also pretty heavy, not just infantrymen, but cavalrymen. We've seen, again, this already in that video about 13th century Polish heavy infantry. Today we look a bit at the time before this, right? What we will concentrate, little spoiler today on, you can see also from the pictures that I used, is the Polish shield, or the Polish shields, of course, of the time, that were particularly important, especially to indicate a specific character of Polish warfare, still importantly close to that steppe influence that the Slavs had historically had to cope with more than the other Europeans in this eastern frontier, for which you can imagine, of course, the nomadic hails of arrows that, especially today, we do not arrive to the Mongol invasion, that will also increase in part the development of such protections, would generate, in fact, the need for particular armament, particular protection, particular shields that would bring these soldiers to be defined, this infantrymen, as clipeati in Latin, so essentially some shield, more than bearers, because the term bearer entails some sort of, you have to carry the shield, so that was your primary need. Now, this was, of course, like a spearman would have a shield, like basic trooper of the time would, but that essentially observed that, of course, the shields within the system highlighted the relevance that such equipment had. This levy en masse of the Polish peasantry was really conceived to a degree of national relevance. Every people, every time there is a kingdom that is established, like in this case, of course, there is a public authority that territorially can extend to encompass the entirety of the realm's subjects as far as regulations and military demands of military service, like this case, are concerned. Of course, as you can imagine, on the not just on the long but also in the medium run, this infantry force of the army, in spite of a certain success, certain circumstances, was soon found to be inadequate. Right, one of its main weaknesses seem to have been the very size. I mean, these weren't particularly qualitative forces. For this reason, you needed a lot of them to make a difference. And first, it's very difficult to control them in general. Right, the hierarchical system is not so robust, even just to check their actions. Many of these people would still be out there for loot rather than any sort of higher civic purpose. Of course, this is, again, you have to understand the mental structures here. Like, if there wasn't like much of a trace of public authority in Germany in terms of political culture, you can imagine what Poland really was. So again, the limit here between the tribal mentality and something more controlled, regulated, is pretty loose. Of course, the leaders, the chieftains, do not give much of a positive example in that direction because they're constantly fighting against one another. But of course, as always, large numbers of men cost a lot. It is true that cavalry costs a lot as well, but it's sort of more controllable because there are less people. They are more qualitatively trained also in those kind of mental cadres as far as their personal allegiance was concerned, so that, as you know, the feudal system would point towards that degree of functionalization. Indeed, had you been projected into the 11th century, say, average Polish engagement, you would have seen a lot of infantry. Also a lot of cavalry. Again, the limit was pretty labile because cavalrymen were also often dismounting and or having sort of a lighter profile. And so infantry had an edge on this type of cavalry, for example. And it could, as we were saying before, oppose itself successfully even to the heavier cavalry. The problem is that the villager there has that potential, but he does not know better. We've seen it often in the videos about the medieval peasant revolts, also much later in time, that, of course, if the peasants had truly had an awareness of their comprehensive potential, they could have literally paralyzed the system and even win place in parliamentary representation. They all failed clamorously, so you can imagine in the 11th and 12th century being there even less awareness. Paradoxically, these were even stronger than later in relative terms compared to the elite that was just sort of muscling up at this point. But they wouldn't see even properly the purpose of living in a different way than what they had normally done. And on the contrary, much of the Druzyna's, say, estate was established to confer more stability to these communities by their same demand, right? These people didn't want raids, they didn't want war, they didn't want perturbances. They preferred giving part of their liberty to these people that were naturally not. Also, there is a very thin balance also in here. The Druzynas, the nobility, were shockingly violent, and especially they had an enormous contempt towards the lower estate. There was, in that sense, a bit of that's what the Polish szlachta would recover in the form of sarmatism, the idea that, of course, the hero, the heavy cavalryman, the aristocrat, the nobleman, is inherently superior to the rest of these people, and especially if you have a bit ingrained, that sort of step overlord, autocratic mentality in your background, you will have, in fact, a much more ruthless and repressive behavior towards the lower estates that, as we've seen, are that looser and sort of more easily subjectable. This is true in Ruthenia. That would boom exponentially with the Mongol invasions, of course, because, again, the countries were very different. The concept of Eastern Europe was really made at the time, right, with some approximation. Again, Ruthenia was much more of a sort of Central European thing before the Mongol conquest. So the point being that, as you understand, PS Poland is, first of all, of course, the huge deal of putting this enormous system together, because Poland is pretty big, and its initial borders are, before the Ostsiedlung, are actually overlapping with the same identical one of the country. Then, of course, as you know, Poland shifted towards the east gradually, right, and then it was repristinated in a way that actually did not correspond much to the ethnic, in fact, settlement that it had achieved by that point only after World War II, right? So that many people remain severed from. I mean, there were lots of Poles in today's Belarus, for example. You see, in this communist sort of deportations, readjustments, like we do not even know, for example, who did repopulate Warsaw to be this after the war? Nobody really knows, because there are not really sources or evidence, or at least it all must be still studied research, right? This is the overwhelming difference that exists between Western and Eastern Europe today. It is definitely the steeper within the continent. and that nobody cares about. That's actually the worst aspect of it all. That nor the left nor the right want to acknowledge this, because it goes against their flawed narratives, the ones they decided to use. Aside from this infantry was typically militia. They wouldn't fight very far from where they were based. Some elements would join, in fact, the Druids in a more professional sense themselves as infantrymen, right? They're still at this point mounted infantrymen. There is also something similar to what was happening in Germany with the ministeriales. That is to say, rural serfs that are implanted, especially during the first phase of the PS expansion, into the subjected territories, essentially garrisoning some fortified settlements for their lords that, despite being non-freemen, will actually elevate their status because of this subordination over the local, namely freemen. All right. Again, the level of personal worth, the more east, the more north you go, in Europe in general, is it's sinking. Right. This is also why the Baltic Crusades, just next to these places, will become, with the only exception of the Mongol invasions, likely the single most traumatically violent chapter of medieval European history that we can document, because there is also the previous time in the same places that it's better not to have been documented at all in hindsight. Right. There is also another dynamic, which is the gradual stratification of this peasantry over time, that in Poland definitely takes shape in the 13th century, so it doesn't really concern us for today, but that is also deeply connected, in fact, with the Mongol invasions. As you know, Poland was invaded thrice by the Mongols, and we archaeologically know that the pre-Mongol invasion Poland was essentially wiped out to a large extent at the very roots of the local buildings, right? And that there was, of course, a lot of dirt, wood, stone overwhelmingly appears after the Mongols, right? This is a radically traumatic event that reshapes the entire Polish world, also making the oligarchic autocracy escalate, not just by the shockingly violent impact on the peasantry, but of course the ever more enhancedly autocratic mentality of the Polish Szlachta. However, you also have, in fact, the foundation way more robust, fortified towns that have learned the lessons from the Mongol invasion, that are connected with, in fact, an increased social stratification, in which some communities' elements were specifically deputed to the military tasks, next naturally to the general levels of the surrounding peasantry and so on. It, however, is again a much more subordinated population now than before. This, of course, has also a virtuous development, because Poland, as we were saying, is actually developing into a, say, orderly, compact, hierarchical system that will be particularly successful, especially from the 14th century, and that was capable, like Hungary, for example, as well, in spite of all, again, the shortcomings, the deficits, and so on, to rise relatively fast back on their feet after the Mongol invasions. These military systems, of course, revolt, and we're talking just militia then. There was, at this point, a properly feudal system with knights and so on, but these infantrymen are mostly provided by such still rural background, and also by the towns that are, of course, also the places where maybe the average person has actually a bit more of wealth and they can equip themselves satisfactorily, not being knights, but being better than the average infantryman. And so especially having a defensive gear, having, as we will see now again, developed particularly effective equipment to cope against the semi-nomadic warriors of the steppes. Poland is also quite composite. Like the southeast is very influenced by steppe warfare, because the steppes are just next door, right? Silesia in the west is instead heavily Germanized. We talk about, if anything, Ottokar II of Bohemia's panoply that reflects that, in fact, Western Slavic Germanization, full Germanization in arms and armor. Bohemia, for sure, was the independent country in which this happened more systematically. Poland, in it's much more composite, right? But in the West, indeed, has that much more less distinguishable Western profile from the German, especially like the German Eastern frontier, that in turn was somehow more primitive and underdeveloped than Western Southern Germany. Naturally, infantry in medieval Poland does not seem to have had a particular development. Like the European infantry was all pretty similar to one another. However, there were countries in which definitely infantry was stronger, it was capable of coping with and even defeating heavy cavalry. At some point, some infantrymen would also be tasked with functions like guarding camps, the baggage train, so some more auxiliary role sometimes. This is the great problem of ancient medieval warfare, that we often don't know how many of the thousands of infantrymen that the chronicles tell us having participated to a given campaign or engagement be just field aides rather than fighters. Actually, I think there is a great distrust towards narrative sources. I talk about it, but not only. There is also the sense that medieval armies had to be small. We always have to pick like the lower end of the estimate. Yes, I also tend to do so, but only evaluating the general context. There is not such thing like the Middle Ages, and sometimes these forces could be actually pretty large, and we shouldn't also be fooled by the level of political fragmentation, because actually the level of populist militarization in the Middle Ages was notoriously higher than Frederick the Great's Prussia, let's say, that incidentally is also part of the same Poland, right? As we were premising, and as the aficionados among you know, we, however, stick to armament. There were, of course, classes of recruitment to some degree. There was a first and less numerous group that was referred to in Latin as loricati, the loricati, plural. That, of course, means the armored element. These classes, we're talking essentially, in part, these fortified towns as sort of communities, aside from probably the feudal hierarchy, that of course worked in sort of different clienterly but vassalic fashion. As we were saying before, among these local communities, there were knights, right? Not just armored warriors, as there were also as non-noblemen, that however would have surely a higher status among the rest of the community. I made recently a video about 13th century Poland and Bohemia that shows you how, in fact, some knights also, for example, prior German businessmen were settled in Poland, say in this case, having founded a town that was actually not populated just by Germans, but also by Poles as actual citizens, that would become some sort of lord of the place, even though he didn't necessarily come from a military background, but he sort of would develop that, and knights could settle at the same time. So we're looking at this kind of reality next to the great estates of the Polish, say, ethnic oligarchy, to stress the social divide that was, of course, ruling mostly all around, and part of course, these communities as well. Some of these loricati were horsemen themselves, so they could afford a war horse, etc. They were typically armed with the usual helmet, mail shirt. There are varieties. There's scaled armor, for example, to an important degree, especially in the earlier period, but shield, spear, sword, secondary weapons like war axes and bows, essentially all the type of weapons that we'll see now the infantry could have, but just to a lesser degree, because they had less training, less wealth, and so they wouldn't even know how to use it proficiently. The second element in the recruitment class was the aforementioned clipeatus. So this shield bearer, that is the figure we actually concentrate on today. Because there would be other infantrymen in the form of light forces like skirmishers, archers, and so on. Here we're talking this video heavy infantry, right? So actual line infantry, you could say. And this clipeati would also be equipped with spear, battle axe, and bow. Sometimes they would have also sword, as we will see later. The reason why it would be called after the shield is that essentially this was the most important piece of their equipment, and they were essentially protected just by that, right? Definitely the average Polish infantryman did not have much metal armor to protect himself with. He wouldn't even need it. This is why particular shield designs were developed to make up for that. Remember also, life, generally speaking, costs less in certain places than others. There is surely an increasing use of swords over time, which is really normal, but it wasn't really that frequent to see a sword-armed infantryman among these forces. Poland is also gradually interconnecting with the rest of the world, so we will see now which were, in her case, the places where these swords would be imported, even for ending up in the hands of an humble clipeatus. So the first most important weapon obviously was the spear. We're talking 2 meters in length. We see it from the remains found in various burials that are actually continuing pretty late into 12th century Poland. It's not to say that these people were not Christianized, but in the French, like, some weren't and or would have not received essentially the sense that they didn't have to bury themselves in arms according to more conventional Christian practice. This is naturally quite useful for documenting this armaments. We have surviving spearheads, some with rather broad lancet-like or leaf-shaped heads, which suggest also some relatively scarce amount of armor around. We also have javelins still. This is really the norm also for Western Europe. Think about William the Conqueror's Norman knights still, throwing javelins to soften up the enemy ranks before charging in. As we recalled before, Polish cavalry was pretty numerous and lighter, so skirmishers were all around there, and knights would habitually use this. And there is also another technical issue that sometimes we do not know how to classify a spear from a lance, right? So the function is pretty much the same. You can use them in both ways, and of course over time there's a greater tendency towards the specialization for heavier cavalry spears with important penetrating power and length, and javelins also gradually disappearing, if not remaining just in in siege warfare tendentially, and being quite effective against armor, telling the truth. However, at the beginning, and especially in this context where there are lighter fighters, it's not really clear what kind of, say, type of weapon we're talking about. They could be used in both ways, if anything. It's not much of a problem even. However, already by the beginning of this period, the more typical spear was provided with a massive blade, rhomboid in section, unitely designed to fight against armored opponents. This is especially true for cavalry, but not only. This type was already becoming predominant, especially the heavier types would become ever more widespread in order to pierce shields, mail halberds, so pointing at the gradual happening of Polish warfare. There are also pole arms, fundamentally, that, as you know, escape categorization quite easily. We talked about them in a dedicated video about the general medieval pole arm. I mean, what is the deal with them historically and why they were so important. Indeed, among these quasi-tribal infantrymen, there were lots of, first of all, sort of empirical heterogeneous solutions, but also specific functionalizations for properly damaging armored opponents, unhorsing knights, say. Of course, these would have been stopped by pikes that also were out there, so you see these heavier spears, but the guys in the posterior ranks would be deputed to finish off, to either come out from the frontal ranks and finishing off the wounded enemies in front of them, and or when cavalry managed to break through, and so would also, however, have to stop into the mass of the infantrymen unless the formation wasn't breaking and giving way, to butcher them down. We see locally made spearheads like axe heads remaining undecorated, with samples inlaid with silver that we have to connect with Scandinavian imports. There were also winged spearheads with lateral lugs below their blades that are often imported from Germany, also treasured because of the general cost and the relatively slower development of arms and armor locally. Then we have the sword that in the case of the infantry was normally short. All right, they didn't need to have these blades, swinging around or slashing from top to bottom like the one of the Druzinas from horseback. There is, again, relatively few armor around, so if these peasants had to murder one another, they would preferably actually engage with a spear, even in individual combat, but then also pass to the swords if things were getting closer, as they would often do. However, swords were rare among these forces, especially in the earlier period. The war axe, for this reason, especially among the Central European woodsmen, a much more convenient weapon and tool at the same time. Some of these axes are bearded, that is to say, you have a hook, the lower portion of the axe bit extending the cutting edge below the width of the butt, providing a wide cutting surface while keeping the overall mass of the axe low, so cutting more with a bit less of a penetration, but also with less cost, and especially against an armor, and less energy spent against a poorly armored opponent. It doesn't take much just to cause pretty serious wounds even with smaller blades. These axes had also a spike or hammer on the side, facing away from the blade, sometimes at least, which is actually an anti-armor occurrence. However, the simple axe heads had flat backs, right? And so indicating that it wasn't even after all that much armor around. The bearded type of axe is probably also resented of some sort of Viking influence. Some of these weapons could be imports themselves. Examples decoratively inlaid with non-ferrous metals were similarly exceptional. There were many other types of weapons derived from agricultural tools. We are not well documented about them because sources, of course, care, even just iconographically, just more about, of course, the elite forces, etc. But we can imagine that, and altogether they were effective weapons. They were throwing axes as well. I talked a bit about this, not much about Poland, but the Baltic world, that is, however, fairly similar, especially in the southwestern part, of course, in the Eurasian steppes warfare series. Right? So they are pretty functionally equipped forces for the role that they normally own in here. There is a lot of guerrilla, there is a lot of ambushes, skirmishing. So these forces are great, even just for commando operations. If normally, of course, they would have to be guided by some professional, but at least some elements within this town, village levies were capable of doing that. They still had the sort of, again, war band mentality for which the youth was to go out there and prove themselves into battle. You can imagine all the kind of feuds and violence that existed, especially in the less regulated places at this again very archaic time, like 11th, 12th century Poland is really something. Unfortunately, we're not that documented, but again, what can you do? Completing the offensive armament, we do not see it much today, but that's also because, in fact, there was a tendency towards a more specialized differentiation, is archery. Right? The bow was widely used by Slavic foot soldiers in general. We'll explain now better in conjunction with the shield why, but they're not necessarily the same people. I mean, sometimes they are, and this is the point, that the average, again, Polish woodsman would have gone around, of course, with a bow, if anything, like many other Europeans would, but it would be more typical of these areas in the more east you went. We can observe fragments of an almost straight bow of simple wooden construction found in Krakow. Poland did not have much of composites in spite of steppes influence. This is kind of obvious also because in sedentary Europe we always made bows only in one way. Historically, you would find long bows, of course, also in Poland. Composites would have been more frequent in the southeast, right, of the country. There's another specimen from Babel Hill that could have been 180 centimeters long, which is a longbow. Consider that there is, of course, no difference whatsoever between a longbow and a bow, except that the one is bigger than the other. And of course, the bigger the man, like longbows, especially in this non-professional context, were properly developing on the basis of the individual needs and physical capacities, right? And however, we can approximate the size given that we own only fragments, right? In this case, 65 centimeters long, which is enough for us to understand what the structure substantially was. Consider that aside from the contacts with Ruthenia, the steppes, Poland gradually witnesses the spread of the crossbow, especially during the 12th century among her infantrymen, and not only. Consider that, again, there had always been significant amounts of horse archers among the mounted troops. So at that point, you have the westernization of Poland in a Frankish sense, through the spread of sort of heavier kind of arms and armor, just in terms of power and effectiveness. For, of course, a population that was getting also a bit more disarmed, organized with, as we've seen, specific parts just of the community that are deputed to fighting in an ever more technical and expensive way, for which the rest of the population had to work and provide, in fact, such means. Now, before passing to the shield, that the most interesting part of the panoply, we observe body armor. Because yes, metal armor was relatively rare, however, other forms of protection, aside from the shield, of course, were there. The most common type of body armor for a Polish infantryman of the 11th to 12th century would have been a 3/4 length, sleeveless, leather or kilted linen jerkin, often reinforced with small iron plates or strips of studded leather, and often fur-trimmed as well. This would, of course, be a quite heterogeneous solution depending on the individual soldier. There were, of course, ways to generalize such construction, but remember, many of these people's background is really very primitive, handmade, like sort of they had to provide with their own equipment, so they adapted their protection on their own possibilities and their own persona. There could be also more elaborated forms of studded leather armor. As we've seen, there were the loricati as well. Here I inserted among the pictures some heavily armored guys that you could have seen, of course, around already, especially during the 12th century. Helmets were there as simple skull caps most of the times, with nozzles as well. So it's not like you couldn't find the more heavily armored guy, but that was somehow a rarity. They tended to gravitate around some sort of horsemanship as well, and or being part of some military clientele that sort of involved him in some kind of more professional, semi-professional business than the others. The lightness of the equipment is sometimes functional to that more sort of hit-and-run tactics that are widely present at this point in historical Poland. The main deal, however, is that these are veritable heavy infantrymen, so they have primarily a line function. They fight in formation against heavy opponents or lighter ones, and especially given the necessity of an average Polish peasant to care, of course, about his well-being in case of attack of some other Polish or sometimes also some nomadic horsemen against his village, his farm, there was the need from the side of these levies to develop a defensive gear that had in the shield sort of the most functional response. The clipeati, in Latin, tarczownicy in Polish, that means essentially, roughly, shield carriers, were called like this, as we explained, because their shield was essentially the most important part of their panoply, the most noticeable, the one that they would also take some pride in some ways that we can't fully understand. Surely these shields were all painted, they had symbols on them, that could also be connected with the identity of their community and more. However, of course, there is a very hardcore material function to these that is especially evident from the shape of the same shield. This is a topic that we will cover for so many other, especially Slavic contexts, especially in Ruthenia, Serbia, Bulgaria. In some cases we already discussed it, but for example, why did the so-called pavis emerge first in early 13th century Lithuania, and actually as a cavalry and even light cavalry shield? People think that the pavis was such a great, technological achievement, or it was the typical pavis of 15th century troops that was carried as like just covering the entirety of your body. No, things are in a sense much simpler in a technical sense, but also more complex from a historical point of view. Essentially, you have in Europe a crescent stretching from the southwest in the Balkans to the northeast in Ruthenia that is constantly in contact with the horse archers of the steppes that intrude very often. This is not just about the Mongols. You have the Cubans, for example, that happily roam around in places like today's Slovakia, like the boundaries between Germany, Hungary, and so on, for not talking about the lower Danube, etc. During the later Middle Ages, with the Mongol and Turkic invasions from the east, you even have a reinforcement of such pressure and influence, right? In the Renaissance, pike and shot tactics will deal with the horse archer of the steppes in a quite decisive fashion, but throughout the entire Middle Ages, we can notice in this crescent the development of a particular shield shape that is quadrangular, quite similar to that sense of camping table, right, brought to even be fixed somewhere on the ground, but you should never make it a matter of rigid categorism or of even actual prevalence, right? Many of these shields were actually mobile, were conceived to be mobile. Many shields historically were heavy to the point that they had to be just left on the ground because they would have destroyed your arm. I mean, even the Roman scutum was conceived like that. Have you ever moved an 8 kilos luggage with a single arm and counted how long you can take that before exhausting your muscles? This is a similar thing, and it's also connected not just with the rectangular form but the flatness, because this type of shield is the best one you can use to create a shield wall in obviously the primary function of anti-missile type. There are a lot of mentally disturbed people that for decades have somehow believed that the shield wall is such sophisticated tactic of the art of war that allows you to defeat. No, every single stinking, capable, stupid, idiotic, unprofessional militia can make a shield wall. That's literally the most vanilla type of thing you can ever imagine. There is nothing offensive about it. There is technically actually nothing particularly flattering in the sense that if you rely too much on this, it means that you're actually concerned in taking that much. This is the case for these infantries actually, that are actually part of a superior system, because the sedentary world is superior to the nomadic one, but essentially must take these hails of arrows and develop particular shields to essentially take that. Also developing counteroffensive measures, in this case with archers, that we have seen being present to a higher degree in the east. Any kind of skirmisher, it's not just also about the arrow, it's also about the javelin. The fact that you can hit an enemy from a distance doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hit him better, more effectively. That way, horse archery is overrated. That's why they needed also lots of them to make some effect. Even the Slavs could sort of cope with this in spite of their generally looser political and societal ties, the lack of bigger statal professional systems for quite some time. And the reason being, first of all, flat shield, yes, you can overlap them to a degree that makes them compatible, but essentially to create some sort of homogeneous front, and especially not allowing arrows to pass like it would happen with a noble shield, for example, on the sides, right? When the shield curves down, like it leaves a part of the, of course, of the frontal surface, in the air, right, penetrable, and therefore between these gaps, projectiles can come to hit people behind you and so on. So the best way actually to protect yourself from such kind of very heavy missile fire is this type of shield, right? The reason why the Pavis, even though it appeared first in Lithuania, but it was really developing pretty much everywhere in some ways, actually stems from, is generalized in Europe from its Italian spread, is the fact that in the peninsula, of course, there was a shockingly imposant level of crossbow use, both in terms of single technical performance and especially the overwhelming amount of also professionally trained crossbowmen. That in fact is the location where, also to prove that actually that Western warfare was inherently superior even to the one of the steps, in, for example, in volume of fire. You don't want to know what can happen, how many quarrels can be shot in a single battle, in interest of time, and that this type of designs were there particularly because of their anti-missile capacity. Of course, this could work also in an anti-weapon sense, but let's say the physics of a spear sword combat is slightly different. It doesn't really require all that weight, especially. You need more mobility, less shield, and somehow more armor at that point than anything. In part, surely, the fact that there was less armor in the Slavic world is connected with, especially among this sort of average militia infantryman, with the necessity of having the shield as a response. But this particular shape, this particular design is connected primarily with anti-missile functions. Likely these shields were also thicker than just the ones used, say, I don't know, during the migration era in general, like in part because also the ones we document better from, say, Western Europe were accompanied by greater amount of armor in proportion. So there is always this relative calculation you have to make. But the sense being that the penetration of a very piercing, like sort of perpendicular angle projectile loaded with all its force could be stopped by this. And this is technically what the etymology of Pavis means. It has nothing to do with Pavi, as some antiquarian sources say. It has to do with the concept of pavimentum, from pavere, which means to actually, say, hammering to thicken, in a sense. So likely these shields were sort of more stratified internally, and this is what the way they were built, and sort of pressing these wooden sheets. Unfortunately, we do not really have a great deal of archaeological influence from 11th and 12th century Poland regarding this type of shield. There is, however, some fragmentary evidence that suggests that such shields, that, as you understand here, targe, that the etymology is the one of the targe, right? Problem in definition, as we'll explain now, could, however, reach 120 centimeters in height, which is a lot, and it effectively puts such shield in the same class as pavises, depending at least on what you call it in this way. Like, as I said, I published something on this, and I prefer the sense of stratification, right? So here we do not necessarily have the evidence of this. We should also point out, as we were saying before, that of course these Eastern European shields do not seem to have been particularly thicker compared to, say, I don't know, one can say that how shields develop in some other places. It's complicated to even start discussing this because we, especially at this time, for this time, we don't have much evidence to compare stuff with one another. There were lots of shields at the time, and we barely have anything today to compare. So systemically, we have no idea whether this was true. But tendentially, and considering that horse archery at large would have actually shot, say, lots of arrows, but also most of them would have not been so terribly penetrating at all. The greater priority of the Slavs, even at this time, 11th, 12th century, would be extensional protection, not one in depth. Which is also interesting because if you evaluate this type of shield as a pavis, the sense of, for example, the Lithuanians having created something closer to that conceptually for some scholar to have defined that can be actually pushed back in time to other times, like in this case. Our 11th, 12th century Poland could have had some very sort of relatively pavis-like designs that also, again, would develop for the specific reasons that these peoples had, not because there was some, especially at this point, deterministic reason why these shield types would eventually develop further later. Also, what is this? A tarch? Because that's what these troops are also called in vernacular. This is mostly a scholarly historiographical problem than a terminological one. Or is it a pavis? Or is it a mantlet? What the hell is this? Like, maybe it's just, I don't know, some shield used preferably for siege war, but positionally. What the hell do we know? We haven't the footage of these guys fighting with in which circumstance. But we can easily understand what the general function could be, why we find this rather than another type of shield, and so how likely it is that, compared especially with the rest of the Slavic world at large, we can make such suggestion. We have, of course, evidence for other types of shields. For example, on the denars or coins from the reign of Boleslav II the Bold, dating around the 50s and the 70s of the 11th century, we can see a horseman carrying a large kite-shaped shield, plus a lance with a pen on. Okay, so of course, in some ways we think that such iconography, we discussed this also, for example, for many countries, especially in the historical regional warfare series, that Western Slavs, the Hungarians, even as far away places like, especially the Ruthenian Palatinate, would tend to imitate the iconography of the German, the Holy Roman Imperial seals and coins. So also to show what was typical of the elite, of course, as always, the imitation of the more updated foreign influence. So showing that you were actually a better ruler, especially to your own subjects, and also being recognized more as an equal on the international scene. So we do not know how, for example, Boleslav II would fight. Maybe he would fight, surely, at some point with a kite-shaped shield, of sort. However, other sources strongly suggest that for this time, the mid-late 11th century especially, Polish shields would be of the more archaic circular form, essentially the ones from the migration, Viking era kind of style, right? And this makes sense, especially if you consider how, of course, like mounted combat would have been, especially for the heavier troops, actually less frequent to a degree, at least in that kind of thickly packed shock charge formation and tactics that was being so structurally and systematically consolidated in the West. However, the Polish nobility did westernize over time, starting from this century, so it wouldn't be so strange after all to find such shield types already in use at the time. And surely if, on such public sources we can see the same monarchy sponsoring such iconography, like we can understand, of course, it was a thing, and that direction, in fact, would be that one. Speaking of clothing, for, of course, like general appearance of these troops, we have the decorated floor from Wilica, dating to 1166-77, which is a rare illustration of costume during this relatively early time. We don't have too much. This is actually a very good source because it depicts from the mid-12th century the Polish rural elite. So exactly the guys that would have stood out among these, in fact, local levies in terms also the better clothing in this case. We find there is also a female cloth. Here, as far as the male one is concerned, we see a wool cloak, because Poland is not that blessed by mild weather. In case you don't know, when you travel to Poland, even fairly late in spring, just be always alert for the charades of local weather. In fact, that Poland in this sense is much milder than everything that lays northeast, by the way, which when we will talk, as we will do soon, about Baltic warfare, for example, Baltic crusades, that you must always remember. This woolen cloak would be pinned with a gilded bronze brooch. It would be some particular styles like extensions that had a symbolic meaning from the upper corners, each fitted with a bronze strap end. Both the man and the woman's dress are edged with embroidered or applique decoration. And the man has also a broad spearhead with silver inlay decoration around the socket, so these would be the guys that would even import stuff from other countries. They could, through the trade routes of the time, Poland was fairly isolated, telling the truth. It didn't really have a satisfactory access to the sea, but there were ways, of course, these items would circulate. And Poland was also pretty central in many routes from south to north, west to east, and vice versa. And we see here the broad spear head, which is also connected a bit with that word of less armor, even though, as we've seen, the actually prevalent type of spear would be probably an anti-armor weapon, would tend toward that direction during this period. So this is pretty much it. Obviously, there would be so much more to say, especially about the shields, because we will partly see these guys in action in some battle video, but it's obvious that these infantries had an important auxiliary role for the nobility. They would be the ones facing eventually, for example, the Mongol onslaught and having to resist in open field against the hail of arrows that those nomads would pour on them. They would have some, again, counter offensive capacity, missile-wise. Overall, there is an homogeneity across Poland. The fact that the country is politically fragmented during most of this era doesn't mean that the styles, even across a fairly large region like Poland, would be so radically different. Because social stratification was fundamentally poor, as a consequence, the ways of fighting would be relatively similar to begin with. All right. Then, all around Poland, there are different types of warfare surely influence her. So there are such differences at some point as well. Just they're not so radically altering the military fabric of the local style. The video is pretty much about this. I'm glad we talk about medieval Polish history, because it always seems like we don't do it enough considering the importance of the country historically. We have to do more, right? I have a lot of Polish warfare content upcoming. At least there is always quite some interesting thing to say that you can't find much elsewhere. I just want to check how much Polish history, King of Poland, medieval Poland, because I have actually lots of playlists. Only 17 videos about medieval Poland. And yes, one is about the Polish heavy infantryman of the 13th century, is about the 11th, 12th century one. So that gradually we can actually add, and I'm glad we have this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.